produce a phenomenon, then it's not scientific to say the phenomenon exists, because the scientific method says that you have to be able to reproduce a phenomenon in order for it to be real. So, okay, so that was the portion of my talk, very abbreviated, describing what's wrong with the official theories. And I think the next two sections are more important because these are direct evidence of demolition, not just saying that they can't come up with an explanation. These features that were documented by the numerous photographs and videos taken of these events show that they had this explosiveness, all these features like this. The blast waves were so intense that they just blew out the windows all throughout these financial center buildings that were 400 feet away from the nearest tower. It hurled debris, and this is like 400 feet up in the tower, just explosively hurled in all directions, steel pieces being blown as far as 500 feet radially, all directions from the towers. Demolition squibs are features seen in controlled demolitions where puffs of dust suddenly emerge from the facade. And these are seen clearly in the North Tower. They're much more apparent when you watch a video, and these squibs just instantly pop out of the building with velocities of maybe 100 feet per second. They just shoot out of the building by 100 feet. And they're well below the area of complete destruction. So these couldn't possibly be caused by floors falling down and squeezing out air, because if that's the case, then what's generating all this pulverized concrete up here? The floors are the only concrete element in these buildings. And yet you have these high velocity gas ejections occurring as much as 20 stories below the zone where the whole building is just breaking up. The way I describe what happened to the towers is that I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into these clouds of dust with steel hurling in all directions. And these explosions became over 500 feet in diameter by the time they reached the ground, actually more like 800 feet in diameter. But the reason I think people don't think of them as explosions is because they occurred over a period of 15 seconds in either case. So there wasn't a particularly, normally people think of an explosion as you hear a loud crack, a bang, and then it's just that one event. But if you have, in the case of a demolition where you might have thousands of explosions that are all blending in, then you get one huge explosive event, but you don't hear any distinct explosions that's so much above the roar of it. The thing sounded sort of like an ocean wave, just this incredibly loud roar. But incredibly explosive. The tops, I described them as mushrooming because they blew out so far. This is the North Tower, and this distance here is about 120 feet. The tower is 207 feet across the face. So, and this is only a few seconds into the collapse, and this stuff is being hurled out with a lot of lateral energy to be thrown that far out. And they mushroom, and this cloud just becomes larger and larger as it goes straight down to the ground. The symmetry is probably the most telling element. I spoke a little bit about that earlier, in that they followed the vertical axis of the building. The destruction followed the axis of the building in both cases all the way down. Even in the case of the South Tower, where the top had started to lean for 2 seconds, and then it just disintegrated and just went all straight down to the ground. Hurling debris in all directions. The steel skeleton was shattered and thrown for distances up to 500 feet. The FEMA itself illustrated the fallout pattern. So again, I emphasize that natural phenomena follow the path of least resistance, not the path of maximum resistance. So this is not possibly a natural event, that the tower is just falling down. It's being systematically destroyed. That's the only explanation for the symmetry. Each tower disappeared into a volcano-like cloud of dust. I mean, the comparison of these events to volcanoes is very telling. It was like, when these towers came down, the dust was so thick that it was pitch black on the streets. And the clouds were thick too. Hanschel talks about this photographer talks about being picked up and carried a block by the dust. It was so thick. And the dust was apparently had the 90,000 tons of concrete in each tower just pulverized into dust so fine that it stayed suspended in the air for a few minutes. So the non-metallic objects in the towers were pulverized to fine dust, including the bodies of people, which 1,000 of which were never even recovered, even though they were looking at little tiny dust samples and using advanced DNA techniques. But the only recognizable objects at ground zero were pieces of metal that aren't so easily destroyed. There was just shards of metal, as if the buildings were just shredded. They were just shredded, and the dust was inches deep, as far as blocks away from ground zero. That's what happened. The people, the gypsum, the concrete is all in this dust all over the Manhattan. So very few pieces of steel were longer than 30 feet. It made it very convenient for the cleanup operation. They could load it on trucks without cutting it up. And there was this intense heat that persisted for over 100 days. Ground Zero smoldered into December because there was so much residual heat. So all those are features of controlled demolition, maybe features that are beyond controlled demolition in terms of the excess heat, in terms of the degree of pulverization. But that's all the more evidence that these were controlled demolitions, because to get an event that's even more destructive, you need to put even more energy into the explosives, presumably, that pulverize these buildings. Now, the final section is to actually break it down into proofs. Here's an argument that shows, here's a series of arguments that actually shows that demolition is the only plausible explanation. The first one is just to look at the pulverization of the concrete. What you see in the case of both buildings is this intense pulverization, this white clouds of concrete. These are clouds of concrete and gypsum. And by the distribution, by the opacity of these clouds as they're being ejected, by the distribution of mass around these buildings, I mean, they didn't just fall straight down on the footprints, they radiated out all over the place, and probably just a small fraction of the mass was within the actual footprints of the buildings. And especially the concrete, which is just all over the streets. Apparently, virtually all the concrete in these buildings was thoroughly pulverized. There's 4-inch thick concrete floor slabs on every floor in the 110 floors of each of these towers, and there's no evidence of any macroscopic chunks of concrete at ground zero. I mean, you can scour the images, and all you see is dust and chunks of steel. So this is entirely counterintuitive, because if you were to take a concrete block and drop it from, say, the roof of the tower, I'm sure it would smash into a lot of small pieces, but it wouldn't turn into microscopic powder, where the particles are less than 100 microns in diameter. But you need a lot of, explosive energy applied consistently throughout the building to achieve that. This proof, I think, is the one that I think most people get. And this has to do with looking at the way the building came down and the rate at which it came down, but specifically at which the rates of different parts of the rubble came down. So if you were to drop a brick off the roof of the tower in a vacuum, it would take 9.2 seconds to reach the ground. The towers came down completely in 13 to 16 seconds. So by 16 seconds, everything is down. So that's only about 50% longer than gravitational free fall. And that's true of all the stuff that's falling through the air. So the only thing that's slowing down all this stuff outside the profile of the building is air. So the air is slowing things down by, say, 30 to 50 to 60%. But if you look at the inside of the profile of the building, everything's coming down in here, too, at the same rate. Well, but wait a minute. This is falling freely through the air, and it's 100 feet out from the building. It's been falling for a long time. It's falling freely through the air, and even big chunks of steel are falling, at this rate, being slowed down only by air. But here, inside the building, remember, all this mass of the building is supposedly crushing itself, but yet it's coming down at the same rate as the rubble falling through the air. So the non sequitur here is, to believe the official story, you have to believe that all this intact, cold, incredibly strong steel structure that was so strong it can hold this building up in a horizontal crosswind of 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour, and yet the building is providing all that steel structure is providing no more resistance to falling rubble than air is. So it's it's just ludicrous to think that the steel structure would just be crumbling, just self-destructing. That's what it would have to be. It would have to be a self-destructing building. There's another proof that's much more complicated and has to do with just looking at the energy requirements needed to expand the dust clouds. Because if you look at, there's photographs that show the development of these dust clouds, and this one is 30 seconds after the start of the North Tower collapse. And I do a precise estimate, or not that precise, but I look at the at reference points in the dust cloud, and make an estimate. And this cloud by 30 seconds is about 5 times the volume of the building. And there's two main ways that can happen. One is that the turbulence can increase the size of the dust cloud, but to the extent that can't, then all the rest of the expansion has to be provided thermally, by thermal energy evaporating moisture and by just causing thermodynamic expansion. And I come up with an estimate for the total energy requirements of the expansion just of the dust cloud that's well over 10 times the entire elevated mass of the building. That's the gravitational potential energy that is supposedly driving all this destruction. Doesn't even come close to satisfying this energy sink, let alone all those other energy sinks like crushing all that concrete, which would also probably require a lot more than the total mass of the building. And the final proof, and this one I think is also fairly easy to understand, has to do with looking at the way that the top of the south tower came down. Now it first started to tilt, but what you see if you look at it carefully is that it starts to tilt, but right at about this point, the tilting stops as it's going into the dust cloud and actually starts to right itself. That contradicts the law of conservation of angular momentum, barring demolition, because the fulcrum would have been causing it to rotate faster. So the only explanation is that the entire top of the building has been shredded, presumably by demolition, and that's what caused it to stop rotating because the moment of inertia was destroyed. So the conclusion of this is that looking at the physical evidence, at showing the features of demolition, proofs of demolition, and as well as, of course, the total bankruptcy of the official explanations and the fraudulence of the official investigations, leads me to conclude unequivocally that the Twin Towers in Building 7 were all deliberately destroyed through controlled demolition that was not a result of the plane crashes and fires.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Citizens Grand Jury, thank you very much for coming back together 10 months after we first gathered in Los Angeles. It's a brave thing to come out in public these days in question of the United States government and the stories that it tells, and I commend you extremely for being here today. I think our task is also a liberating task, and in that regard, it should be a happy task and one that I think we will enjoy. And my job today is to persuade you to support the findings that we came to last October and to expand those findings and to indict 5 individuals. The first of those individuals is Larry Silverstein, who is the developer of World Trade Center Building 7 and the leaseholder for the Twin Towers, Buildings 1 and 2 of the World Trade Center complex, as well as other properties there. The second individual is Peter G. Peterson, who is also a leaseholder of WTC 7 in his role as chairman of the Blackstone Group. The third individual is David Rockefeller, perhaps the world's most well-known banker and a partner and colleague of both Larry Silverstein's and Peter G. Peterson's in many enterprises. He is the chairman emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the fourth and fifth individuals are the Vice President of the United States, Richard Cheney, and the President of the United States, George W. Bush. Now, you'll probably notice that I said those two officials, Richard Cheney and George W. Bush, last. I did so deliberately because I think they are probably less consequential in the crimes of 9/11/01 than the first 3. And I think at the outset we should examine what the rules are in terms of justifying an indictment. Probable cause is the criterion that is before you. So I would ask you to consider these individuals, their roles, what we can gather from the information that I convey to you in the light of whether there is probable cause to investigate them further for their possible involvement in those terrible crimes of 9/11/01. So, to Larry Silverstein. Now, my great friend and co-author and one of the biggest workers I know in terms of exposing the crimes of 9/11/01, Jim Hoffman, has already shown you conclusively, I think, that the Twin Towers were demolished. My small job now is to prove to you that World Trade Center Building 7 was demolished. And here again, there is much physical evidence that makes that obvious. We've seen footage of WTC 7 collapse in a very dramatic and precipitous fashion. It, in fact, fell in 6.5 seconds, a 47-story building. That is, it fell almost at the speed of free fall. If you dropped a brick from 47 stories, it would have fallen in 5.9 seconds. So the speed and the symmetry of that collapse and its inwardness make it obvious that it is an implosion executed through classic demolition. But apart from all that, we've got the word of its developer, Larry Silverstein, that that building was demolished. Because Larry Silverstein said on a PBS documentary that was aired nationwide September 16th, 2002, America Rebuilds, Larry Silverstein. I remember getting a call from the fire department commander feeling that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire, the supposed non-existent big fire in WTC-7. And I said, we've had such a terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing is to pull it. And they
produce a phenomenon, then it's not scientific to say the phenomenon exists, because the scientific method says that you have to be able to reproduce a phenomenon in order for it to be real. So, okay, so that was the portion of my talk, very abbreviated, describing what's wrong with the official theories. And I think the next two sections are more important because these are direct evidence. They're the only concrete element in these buildings, and yet you have these high velocity gas ejections occurring as much as 20 stories below the zone where the whole building is just breaking up. The way I describe what happened to the towers is that they were, I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into the tower. They're much more apparent when you watch a video, and these squibs just instantly pop out of the building with velocities of maybe 100 feet per second. They just shoot out of the building by 100 feet. And they're well below the area of complete destruction. So these couldn't possibly be caused by floors falling down and squeezing out air, because if that's the case, then what's generating all this pulverized concrete up here? The floors of demolition. Not just saying that they can't come up with an explanation. These features that were documented by the numerous photographs and videos taken of these events show that they had this explosiveness, all these features like this. The blast waves were so intense that they just blew out the windows all throughout these financial center buildings that were 400 feet away from the nearest tower. It hurled debris, and this is like 400 feet up in the tower, just explosively hurled in all directions, steel pieces being blown as far as 500 feet radially, all directions from the towers. Demolition squibs are features seen in controlled demolitions where puffs of dust suddenly emerge from the facade. And these are seen clearly in the north